Velkomin kæri gestir, það ánægilegt að koma hér saman í dag og heyra frá Fulbright-svellinum Katherine Pukinskis sem nýkomin hingað til að vinna með tónlistardeild Listaháskóla Íslands. Viðburðurinn fer fram á ensku og ég skipti nú yfir. Dear guests, welcome, whether you are here in person or online. This year, the Fulbright Commission in Iceland is organizing a series of events to celebrate a couple of important milestones in the US. The 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the 80th anniversary of the creation of the Fulbright program. Our Fulbright Forum today is a part of these celebrations. We're thrilled to have with us as our speaker a Fulbright specialist and composer, Katherine Pukinskis, who is visiting us from Carnegie Mellon University, where she's an assistant professor in composition and theory, and she is hosted by the University of the Arts Department of Music. Katherine is in high demand and has contributed to many universities, including Bard, Harvard, University of Chicago, to name but a few. She has an impressive list of publications and recordings, and she has composed innovative and outstanding work exploring storytelling and voice. The title of her talk certainly has piqued our interest, but before I give her the floor, let me note that we're live on Zoom and we are also recording. We'll be taking questions after the presentation, so if you want to ask questions virtually, you can type them into the Zoom. Katherine, we're excited to get philosophical with you this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here. We'll go forward with this presentation with a little bit of grace for technology and moving between sound and video and presentation. So I'd like to begin by asking you to recall a vivid musical memory, a moment from your past where you were significantly impacted by sound. This could be a performance you attended or participated in, a moment in a film you were watching, or a song you heard while driving in a car. No memory is too big or small. It should just be a moment where music made you feel something big. You got it? Do you have the memory?
No.
All right. American composer and sound experimentalist Pauline Oliveros developed a practice of deep listening, which she said, quote, involves listening in as many ways as possible to everything that can be possibly heard all of the time. Sure, we can listen with our ears, but listening can also be a full body experience. When you think of your musical memory, what can you see around you? Where are you? What can you smell? Can you remember what your body felt like? Was the air cold or warm? How long did the sound resonate in the space? So often when we talk about music, we miss the opportunity to engage the environments and context around the sound of music as part of our listening experience. So today, I'll talk about the ways in which my musical voice is tied to elements of place, the places I have lived or traveled, the places I come from, the places where my ancestry originates, all as contributors to what my music compositions literally sound like. I'll offer some historical context, showing how attributions of sound have evolved over the past 300 or so years, moving from nationality as a defining factor of sound before the 20th century, to an emphasis on where you studied or who you studied with as a link to aesthetic in the 20th century. Today, the aesthetic landscape is vast and rich, and I posit that a composer's sound can, instead, be defined by a natural acoustic and the sensory influences of place. Growing up in the United States, I got used to the casual question, oh, where's that name from? Pukinskis isn't one of those last names that immediately points to a specific country of origin. Lots of people guess Polish or Russian, and the last name was actually Latvian. I had a prepared answer to that question in the States, explaining it was Latvian and then following up to then show or tell people where Latvia was in the world, since most people didn't know. When I studied for a year in England and attendance was taken on the first day of class, the instructor plodded through very British last names down the list until they inevitably reached mine, paused, and stumbled through some variation of Pukinskis. Immediately, everyone's head lifted from the doodling at their notebooks and looked to see which body matched that very outlying name. In the US, I was one of many kids in my class with the last name from somewhere else, but at that time in the UK, my name stuck out as an anomaly. Oh, where's that name from? Was a question I received differently there, and I began to think about lineages of names, the ways that our names tie us to place, and the way that place carries meaning in how people view us. Of course, this wasn't actually a fresh realization. In my music studies, I had learned about composers of classical music, and I was more likely to be able to tell you where they were from than I was to know their first name off the top of my head. In a classical music education in the States, I was taught to be able to identify pieces and composers of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century by two sets of criteria. First, how much did it align with or depart from the sounds of German or Austrian composers like Bach, Beethoven, and Haydn, and the likely nation of origin based on a category of aesthetic generalization listed here on this slide. So Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, and Rachmaninoff, for instance, were emblematic of a Russian sound because of a certain kind of flair for the dramatic, is what I was taught. So we can listen, though, for an example, to a short excerpt from a trio by the Austrian composer, Franz Joseph Haydn, and think of this as the historical baseline. So things feel organized, contained, and I'm going to play from this video on my computer because the sound should ideally be a little clearer for you all. I was taught that German music was in control. This was the point of reference from which everything else emanated. Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, on the other hand, let's see, creates this lush, velvety sound of the orchestra with bigger contrast of volume and register, so high and low sounds. This is the supposed sort of Russian melancholy and drama that I was taught to hear in Russian music. So here's the Sixth Symphony. So very different in sound, right? Composers like Debussy and Ravel from France were often defined by their French sound, often compared to the Impressionist paintings of the time. You could hear more texture or motion in the middle ground and background rather than the melodic material that we heard in the example by Haydn or even by Tchaikovsky. So here's an example of the French sound. Okay, so another example, that's the French sound. So up until this point, I sort of followed the logic. Most of these composers were educated and trained in conservatories within their home country. So it makes sense that at that time, a sort of house style emerged from different pedagogical philosophies, different access to instruments or existing repertoire. There's even some really interesting research that was done that makes a correlation between the natural cadence and shape of the French language and the ways that melodies in French-speaking composers get set. So there's definitely data to show correlation, but most often related to things that aren't related to pitch or rhythm, which we often use to talk about music. But here's where things get a little odd. So a composer like the Hungarian Bela Bartók exists in the classical canon as a representative of incorporating folk tunes in classical spaces. That's what he is known for. So he wrote plenty of music that didn't incorporate folk song, and even the pieces that did involved incredible technique and craft. But the general narrative that I took in as a student of classical music was if it sounded folksy, it was probably Bartók or someone from a similar part of Europe. So here's an example of that kind of sound. So that's Bartók's sort of generalized sound according to Western classical music history. And so then when I learned about the Finnish composer, Jean Sibelius, I was taught that his music was evocative and atmospheric, that there was something about his pieces that reflected the landscape in Finland, that evoking nature was what made his work sound Finnish. So another example, and I know I'm giving you lots and lots of sounds very close together, but I think it'll work to develop a palette of exposure. So here's a quick an excerpt from the opening of his violin concerto. So evocative and atmospheric nature sounds. I love this piece. I think it's stunning, but I'm not sure why I'm supposed to correlate these sounds with the landscape of Finland. That evoking nature was what made his work sound Finnish. Here's a quick, when no one, I'm supposed to correlate these sounds with the landscape of Finland when no one has asked me to consider the landscape of Germany or France when I listen to composers of these other places. And like Bartók and his peers from the eastern periphery of Europe, being the folk song composers, so folk songs here, right? Sibelius and other Nordic composers, and often even those from the United Kingdom, were the composers who somehow wrote about nature. And some of these correlations are true. We have records of Bartók talking about the incorporation of folk music in some of his work. And Sibelius actually did say that some of his music is an expression of specific places in Finland. But he also had to assert that pieces like the violin concerto that you just heard, or his Second Symphony, weren't about nature at all. Those pieces were what we call absolute music, or music that does not represent or depict anything. Programmatic music is a music that has a story or sort of has a representation of material. And we also have examples of German and Austrian composers engaging nature in folk songs. Beethoven wrote the Pastoral Symphony, Mahler included an Austrian Ländler in his Third Symphony, but these are more like outliers instead of trends. Most of my education did not include much conversation about this additional periphery of European nations, highlighted in green, though I now know much more about the classical traditions, repertories, and composers of these places than I did when I was pursuing my undergraduate degree in music. Many composers also famously denied these kinds of national correlations. Igor Stravinsky was exiled from Russia in 1917 and was very vocal about eschewing his Russian nationality as a label and any Russian influences in his music. Debussy actually also wrote about his work Image, or images for orchestra. He wrote, quote, "I tried to make something else of them and to create in some manner realities, what imbeciles call impressionism, a term as poorly used as possible, especially by art critics," end quote. By realities here, Debussy was referring to the approach that he took often with his pieces, where he based his music not on an intermediary, like a painting of the sea, but on a reality, the sea itself. And so he often was very vocal about staying away from impressionism as a label, even though lots of ways that we sort of are learning about Debussy in classical education spaces and higher ed use that label to try and organize the ideas. So we have examples of composers who write music about something and music without a topic, music that invokes a painting versus the thing itself, music that quotes a folk song and music that doesn't, and no consistently hard lines drawn for any category to match other than a national boundary. My issue here is twofold. First, this sort of massive generalization or reduction that there's one specific sound or meaning for a whole nation of composers, also spread over many centuries, and this myth, the comparative practice of centering the German, Austrian, French, and Italian composers as essentially the educated elite, through them being the baseline point of reference, and that their music was defined as sort of high art or high music, and that those on the peripheries of this Central European force were categorized as other because they invoked nature or incorporated folk. Elements that weren't learned in a conservatory education, but instead were part of a very normal daily rural life. Though it isn't an explicit message sent in how we've historically talked about classical music, it is a message sent nonetheless, that the where of your life was the defining aspect of your musical sound. And the category of where were these human-made borders of a nation. In general, composers working in the first half of the 20th century began to sort of move away from their nationality as an identifier of their work. The World Wars were an obvious catalyst for classical music for a few reasons. First, and perhaps most obviously, nationality became an indicator of how your country or your nation fared in either war, what side you were on, who won or lost, etc. Many composers were also forced to leave their homes. Stravinsky, who I mentioned earlier, Arnold Schoenberg, and many, many others, to pursue sort of their academic or their artistic freedom or their religious freedom and safety or their political safety. Additionally, incredible innovations, particularly in how music was spread and how people moved, opened up many avenues for people to visit and learn in new countries. Access to more publicly available travel by train, boat, and eventually plane meant that people could move across greater distances. Advancements in technology led to things like phonographs in homes so that people could listen to recordings of music instead of only hearing it live. Radio technology eventually meant that you could hear music in real time without having to be literally present in the same place. And intertwined with, or maybe because of these advancements and changes, was a splintering of genres and styles in the arts. Composers were able to access repertoire from different places, study with teachers in different countries, learn about traditions and practices outside of their home conservatory. Being exposed to different ways of studying, practicing, composing, and making music naturally expanded the sonic palettes for these composers. Additionally, I think music in the United States in the 20th century finally started to mix into the conversation. Understanding, of course, that my bias is to having been educated in the United States in the very end of the 20th century and start of the 21st. It's not that music wasn't happening there before then, but it was simply such a new nation, and access to the European traditions of classical music was incredibly limited. I'm going to pivot to focus a bit more on what was happening in the US from here because it feeds a bit more directly into my own creative voice, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the thing that I find really interesting about American music at this time, though the term really only and very problematically includes music from just the US, is that classical and popular traditions were developing alongside one another and in very close proximity. American classical music often gets defined with the peripheral categories of both folk and nature. So as an example, Aaron Copland is perhaps one of the United States' most emblematic composers, and his music is often described as evocative of the great open plains or the Wild West in the country, and has clear references to Appalachian folk songs. So in this excerpt, which I'm about to play, you'll hear the tune Simple Gifts, and as it really builds out and gets big, there's a kind of expansiveness in the sound that people correlate with big stretches of open land in the United States. So, and this is actually a recording from 1980 of Aaron Copland conducting the piece. So the sound quality is miserable because it was the 1980s, but I think it's cool to get to see a composer conduct their own pieces. So that's the Simple Gifts tune. And the expansion of sound. So this piece was written in 1944. So sort of, if we're thinking at the same time of what was happening in the 1940s in the United States, Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby were singing, movie musicals were hip, and the US was really coming face to face with these confrontations of nationalism and patriotism in wartime around World War II. Popular and classical music, like I said, were developing in parallel during the 20th century, both in the United States and elsewhere. And within these larger branches, more and more subgenres appeared. Composers were identifying more with their aesthetic style, separate from the country in which they were born. So in place of a French sound, for instance, the 20th century was often organized by institutional voice or aesthetic. Different schools and institutions began to attract international audiences. People went to study based on style, not a nationality. So Paris, for example, was a place that you could study rigorous ear training in classical musicianship with Nadia Boulanger, see Pierre Boulez conduct a brutalist composition of his, hear Olivier Messiaen's non-retrogradable rhythms and bird songs mixed together, or be at the forefront of innovation and electronic music at IRCAM, all within about a 15-year span of each other and overlapping greatly. In the US, composers like George Gershwin and Leonard Bernstein slipped between popular and classical idioms, but most artists identified with one style or the other. As is our wont to do as human beings, we look to categorize these new sounds into groups as a way to better understand this massively widening scope of what counted in 20th century music. Terms like modernism and postmodernism often complemented their visual artist colleagues, but additionally, serialism, neoclassicism, minimalism, the avant-garde, new complexity, aleatory, improvisation, and many other categories define substyles and sub-substyles. Composers ran the gamut of standing high on the hill of their ism identity. So just like Debussy denied his impressionism, Schoenberg, for one, was trying to champion 12-tone serialism as the savior of classical music. And John Adams, who's a living and practicing composer today, despite writing music which checks off basically every box of minimalism, will tell you over and over again that he is not a minimalist. But everybody was sort of tied to schools of thought, many in places other than the country in which they were born. I don't know if you noticed, but I haven't up until this point mentioned a single composer who was a man. Nadia Boulanger, who I did reference, started composition but gave it up very quickly and became a teacher and conductor. And in fact, I haven't actually mentioned a single composer who wasn't a white man up until this point. I reluctantly did this on purpose. White male composers were the 99.9% in my music education in the early 2000s. When we learned about female composers in Europe, like Clara Schumann or Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, we learned about them in relation to their husband and brother, respectively, Robert Schumann and Felix Mendelssohn. These women wrote music too, but they were brought into the conversation as anomalies. The interest in their inclusion was for their gender, not for their German compositional sound. Composers of color come up even less before the 20th century and basically only in American traditions. And even then, they enter into the conversation through popular traditions, ragtime and jazz, for instance, as these sort of crossover artists between the popular and classical genres. Composers like Florence Price or William Grant Still were included in classical conversation for their ability to incorporate Black American musical traditions into their classically passing work. But my question is this: how is it that Bela Bartok made it into the canonical discussions of classical music while composing not even 20 years prior to these composers, but these ones were left out? Each of these four composers that I just mentioned likely had more of an impact on my own creative voice than the others that I've mentioned today. Less for the sounds they wrote and more in the fact that the content of their music had been tokenized or glossed over on account of their marginalized identity. What has been missed in getting to know their music as a part of their lived experience, their training, where they lived, who they worked with, rather than as a sensationalized exception? And so today, in the 21st century, I am sometimes asked, what does your music sound like? Oftentimes people are looking for me to describe it either with a genre or a style or one of those isms I listed on the previous slide, or maybe I could offer some composers that I think I might sound similar to. But the thing is, I'm a very tiny branch at the very tip of this musical tree. My creative voice is a product of all the things I have heard and seen and smelled and tasted and felt and experienced up until this point in my life. My music doesn't sound like anyone else. It sounds like me, just like all of the other composers who are working right now, perched at the tips of their respective branches on this tree and the many other trees in the forest of music being made today. I am a product of my training and education, which has predominantly been in the United States and England. Here, though, it shows itself more through my technique and craft and less like the sound that we might be able to identify by the turn of the 20th century Paris Conservatory or classical music in 18th century Germany. I am a product of the first music I spent significant time with, which includes music written for voices and liturgical music from a Protestant church. That shows itself mostly in my affinity for writing music for choirs, though I almost never set sacred texts these days. I'm a product of my heritage, my lineages of Swiss and Latvian family, and the ways that each of those cultures has been present in my daily life. Our home was filled with different languages and food, traditions, and songs that came from somewhere other than the place that I was growing up, but they were nonetheless part of the fabric of my childhood. I'm a product of my non-musical experience, and this is where I think things start to get interesting. In particular, I am a visual thinker, and more specifically, a spatial thinker. It means that when I'm engaging a mental image, so calling up that musical memory that I asked you to do at the beginning of the talk, if it's a real image, an imaginary image, or remembered image, I put myself in a three-dimensional place. My default is to call up sensory memories. So what it felt like to be somewhere, the humidity in the air, what background sounds were happening, what it felt like to have a wall close to me on this side and maybe much further away on this side, what the fullness of a room felt like depending on the furniture or the people in there. There's a sort of environmental sensation that is part of how I notice myself in a place. Where am I in relation to the other things in the moment? I carry each line of I'm here into my creative practice too. In particular, I think a lot about what it feels like to play the lines that I'm asking someone to make when I write them for them. I think a lot about the shape and acoustics and materials of a room for a first performance, how that might influence how an audience experiences a piece. And very often, I use some kind of tactile, sensory, or spatial memory as a driving inspiration for my creative work. Whether or not those ideas are successfully translated to an audience is a topic for another presentation and a very long conversation, but I think it's an important point of meaning making for me as I compose in the 21st century. The other side of the creative process for me is inspired by a term introduced by American composer George Crumb, who wrote about a composer's natural acoustic. He says, quote, "I am certain that every composer from their formative years as a child has acquired a natural acoustic which remains in their ear for life. The fact that I was born and grew up in an Appalachian River Valley meant that my ear was attuned to a peculiar echoing acoustic. I feel that this acoustic was structured into my hearing, so to speak, and thus became the basic acoustic of my music. I should imagine that the ocean shore or endless plains would produce an altogether different inherited acoustic." The natural acoustic is where things really focus for me, and I think where I'm better able to understand what was unique about those peripheral European countries I mentioned back in the first part of this talk. Place, not the town or the nation or the institution, but the feeling of your environment can play a significant role on the aesthetic of artwork. What I mean by this is just what Crumb says. The topography of the Appalachian River Valley, the way sound traveled or the way weather moved or how the air felt, the density of trees in those particular forests. This peculiar echoing acoustic that he mentioned doesn't necessarily shape the pitches and the rhythms, which are categories we often use to define what music is, but instead is a more textural or abstract periphery of the sound. So Crumb wrote this piece called Vox Balanae, which is the voice of the whale. And now I have to turn my computer back on. And I'm just going to play a little bit of it for you so you can hear Crumb's interpretation of his natural acoustic. So just a very small piece of it. This natural acoustic is like a lens through which Crumb's music is filtered. So instead of him writing a piece about the voice of a whale, because maybe he grew up in a part of the world where he often interacted with them, which isn't the case of the Appalachian River Valley, the natural acoustic instead is like a film cast over the sounds that he's making. So the conversation shifts from what is the piece about into sort of what is the legacy of place that is traced over this music. And using these questions, I would like to move through 3 examples of my own work to highlight the lens of place that is cast over the music that I compose. These pieces show different aspects of how I incorporate my spatial thinking, sensory and tactile sense of place, and Crumb's idea of a natural acoustic into the music I write. So, Estavai Mamiņai is a setting and arrangement of a Latvian folk song. The original tune can be heard actually throughout the whole piece, though it gets progressively more and more difficult to locate it as the piece goes on. So as the verses progress, the harmony gets really dense and kind of ebbs and flows around the melody, and the melody gets folded deeper and deeper into a thicket of sort of twisty and turning sounds. So it never technically disappears, but oftentimes it becomes so overcrowded by dissonance that it's hard to pick it out directly. I grew up spending a lot of time in the woods. This is where my natural acoustic comes in. It was really normal for me to spend an afternoon wandering into the forest at the edge of our backyard in New England, exploring the old stone walls from grown-over farmland, or tracking a stream down the hill toward the river. I feel deeply happy in the woods. There is a stillness there that doesn't exist anywhere else for me. I also go into the forest with an awareness that this is not my home, that I am entering into a place where I am an outsider to the animals and plants who make that place their home. I know also that the forest is very much alive, and whether or not it feels still to me is really quite active. So much is moving and breathing, dying and thriving outside of my view. So here's a tiny bit of sound of Esavai Mami Nyai with the text here on the left. We'll pause there. I think that a lot of my music may give the outward presentation of stillness or contentment, but at the middle or background, everything is just a little more active or unfolding. There's something about a consistently evolving world which is always turning in the background, even in our quietest and calmest moments. This piece, for instance, feels overall quite calm and contained. It's never out of control or jagged, but instead expands and contracts continuously. The inspiration for Maddie, or the sea in Estonian, came from a visit to the Baltic Sea in Laulasmaa, Estonia, in the summer of 2023. The water's character is shaped by wind and weather, always in motion, waves crashing into one another or moving in synchronized motion towards the shore. The Baltic Sea is incredibly shallow for quite some distance out, which means that its volatile highs are dynamic and tense, but when it finds stillness, the piece is like a slow cadence of breath. The natural acoustic and sense of place here are a bit of one and the same. Bodies of water have been a consistent part of my environmental exposure, and I've always enjoyed the peace that comes from looking out at a lake or a river or ocean. One of the reasons I think I find this peaceful is that it's impossible to focus on the details of a body of water. You have to take it in as a whole entity. A single wave might catch your attention for a moment, but it almost immediately disappears into the next wave and becomes something else. So it's really hard to focus in on small details when you're looking at the water. Watching the water always asked me to loosen my grip on the details and take in the larger picture. Similarly, it works the same way as the view from the top of a mountain, which asks me to shift my focus to a collective image versus its components parts. So I'll play a little bit of this piece for you and see if you can try and zoom out your focus, not to listen for anything specific, but instead try to hear the whole unit of the piece. So the third piece, winter outside in, roots itself in all things winter. So having grown up and lived in northern climates, I have known the weather in this season to move quickly from loud and blustery wind to the muffled stillness of quiet snow. I know the balance of gray days with brilliant cold weather blue skies. I know that many plants die in the cold, but others thrive, that some animals fall into deep hibernation while others scurry around and endure the elements. This piece is for choir, orchestra, and bagpipes, so it has text attached to it. And I first sent Matilda Blynn's poem, A Winter Landscape, which evokes a dark, chilly, and brilliantly crisp winter air encompassing the natural northern environment of the season. And so in terms of a natural acoustic, I think similar to the water in Mary, snowfall is another environmental exposure that often asks me to take in the whole experience of the snow. Perhaps I can see a bit more individuality in the flakes than I can in water waves, but the textural or environmental impact in this piece is one of a percolating texture that occasionally gets swept up in longer lines, just like seeing a bunch of tiny snowflakes and sort of watching them moved by the wind. Intended towards instruments and sounds that were thin and metallic and cold. So I can play a very quiet example from the opening, maybe. So that's just a very small sort of feeling of the snow part. And in the second movement, which is attached to the first, I sent a text by Eliza Cook called The Christmas Holly, which we won't hear today, but if you're curious, you can go listen to it. But the second movement sort of invites us indoors and out of the winter's cold. So from a sort of sensory experience of place, I'm sure many of us here in the room in Iceland can recall the sensory experience of moving from blustery cold outside into the warmth of indoors. And so I really wanted to capture two particular changes of state in this motion. First, from the sort of sonic perspective, so outside is expansive and echoing, and then moving inside to sort of a more acoustically warm and closed in space of the indoors. And then the other thing I wanted to try and catch was in this transition from the two movements was to capture that transition of what the skin literally feels like when moving from cold to warm. So think about that sort of bitter bite of cold on your cheeks into that tingling transition as things start to warm up and the smoothness of the toasty indoors. So this is a bit of a longer excerpt, but you can sort of hear that sensory change, right, from cold to warm, the biting parts of the cold into the smooth parts of the warmth. I'm gonna skip a little. And this is the text you'll hear. So now this is the transition outside to inside, cold to warm. Oh, that's an example of sort of the temperature, tactile experience, the bodied experience of place. The first part of this talk is titled, It Sounds Like Home. I have avoided defining home because it seems impossible to capture the myriad places that all of us individually go when asked to think about that word. My concept of home is constantly shifting and evolving as I move through life, and it encompasses people and activities as much as it does a sense of place. Like home, music is something that is so highly individualized. We can all be in this room together, hear the same sounds, and draw widely different interpretations and meanings from the same piece. So when I think about where I'm from, which is where I was born, yes, but also where my parents are from, where their parents are from, where I learned about moving through the world of music, I can see my web of understanding music writ large as a product of the place I grew up, my education, and who I learned from. I can also understand my musical voice through the acoustic palette of my natural environment, the sonic properties, the forests and snowfall, the way biting cold air feels on my skin. I can hear the ways that my spatial and sensory thinking about place feeds into my creative work. So what does home sound like? I think it sounds like me, and I think it also sounds like each of us. So, thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks for your patience also with the technology.
Yes. I'm so glad we were able to work it out. I think we heard the music quite well, the way that you played it.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that.
Yeah. Yes. Do we have any questions from the group here?
Well, I'm the Appalachian piece.
Yeah.
Like the listening to that, it totally brought me into the Western movies when it's like the people are wagon training along,
Yes.
and then like right when they come to that scene where they pan out to the beautiful valley they're gonna call home. That's exactly what that sounded like to me. It was like that idea of now you found this place and here you are, and it's like the music swells and there's the valley, and that was kind of amazing.
Yeah.
To like put that into perspective, what that came from.
And this is definitely a thing also that people like these ideas of assigning place to certain sounds or certain things, like people leverage that in their creative practice, right? We definitely see this in movie scores, that we have sort of been conditioned in Western culture to consume certain sounds and feel certain ways because we've been watching all these correlations, right? So you see something sad happening and probably it's strings moving really slowly, like ascending lines. And so we've been sort of conditioned to be like, oh, this is where I should feel sad, or like a solo boy soprano singing this, long note. That's, something related to grief, or trumpet, perfect fits. Like there's a sort of majestic trumpet sound, which makes us attach those things. So for as complex as it is, it also very much is something that we use for effect to great impact and success. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about experiencing music as a connection to landscape and nature and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I listen to a lot of music just as a amateur, and I also kind of connected the music not only with the landscape and all that, but just to to the nation as a whole. Like French music, I don't visualize only the landscape and so on, but just the being in France and just, like the joy and the like a French piano music, for example, just a French experience in a overall kind of. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I think I really enjoy about music, and also is very complicated about music, is your way of hearing it and understanding it is perfectly correct, right? But it also means that there are, in this room, in this room, as many different opinions or sort of value sets. And so a lot of it also has to do with nostalgia, right? So if I've never been to France before and I heard music by a French composer, I might not have the same reaction as if I had grown up there or I had a really memorable trip there. And so I think that's the thing that's really interesting, is that we use these kinds of connections to do just that, to connect, right? We use these correlations to connect. And sometimes they can be incredibly helpful, and incredibly sort of evocative and meaningful in our experience of music. I know I hear music in Latvia differently because I am of Latvian descent. I hear music by Latvian composers differently because I am of Latvian descent. So I think some of this is to sort of recognize how much our positionality as individual listeners or composers or performers influences how we value the things that we're consuming. I love that question. Thank you.
Yeah. And it also, if you didn't know it was, so that brings us to the question, if you didn't know it was a French composer, what would it then bring up to you?
Yeah.
Then it might bring up something totally different, right? The same piece of music. Right?
Yeah, and I actually, I think about this a lot if I'm at an art museum, because my vocabulary for understanding visual art is very limited compared to my exposure to music. And so oftentimes if I'm in an art museum, I'll look at, who made the work, when they made it, where in the world they were, partially just because it lets me know sort of what was happening in the world at that time. It gives me a sense of context of what are the kinds of experiences or parts of history this person was facing, because there is an additional, talk out there about music and politics and music in the world and the ways that that artists for all of time have sort of navigated their current state in all the meanings of the term. So, thanks. Yeah. Any other questions?
May I just follow up?
Yes, please.
You are here in Iceland now.
Yes.
Is there anything related to Iceland or Icelandic music that you are working on now or exploring?
So I'm not here in Iceland for this project in terms of that, but I have been reading a lot about Icelandic music and thinking a lot about the ways that we also, the sort of narratives inside and outside of spaces people use to explain things. So there's lots of language that gets passed around when we look at classical composers of Iceland, that they're all writing about nature, and it's either like ambient or dark or, nature engaged, which isn't incorrect, right? For some of them, but also, again, trying to sort of maybe fine tune to sort of look into different ways that might actually manifest itself. So that maybe I think about both the shortest days of the year and the longest days of the year, where you get big stretches of time where the light is similar, right? So in the longest days of the year, you sort of get bigger expanses. So maybe there's something about a natural acoustic of somebody who grew up here, where just material evolves at a different rate than somebody who grew up in the middle of New York City, where information was coming into them all the time, right? But it would also mean that it's different if somebody grew up in the heart of Reykjavik, and then, do people live in the eastern fjords? Yeah. So, right, right. And so I think that part's really interesting. There's actually a great book called Dissonant Landscapes, and I couldn't tell you who it's by off the top of my head, but talks about music by Icelandic musicians in all sorts of genres, and how people build these narratives and how also some, rock bands and stuff engage the natural environment here, but then also sort of the disservice we do when we talk about music sometimes and just say, well, of course it's about the nature, if it's not actually about the nature. Yeah, it's called Dissonant Landscapes. Yeah.
Well, I think we're about at the end of our time. Was there some other? No, okay. Then I just want to say again, thank you so much. For a Friday afternoon and a sort of gloomy Friday afternoon, this is a wonderful sort of way to get us thinking and a great way to go into our weekends.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody also who attended, of course, also virtually.
Yes.
And I just want to mention in case someone's interested that Katherine is here as part of the Fulbright Specialist Program, which is a really great Fulbright program that allows for shorter term visits to Iceland for American scholars and experts. And it's a great way to build cooperation. And for Icelandic universities, it can really be a great resource to bring scholars who may not have the time to come for a full semester, to come over and start collaborating in some way. And the specialist grants have often led to such long-lasting and wide collaborations far beyond the few weeks that the person is here. And we want to thank you for coming and being a great addition to our Fulbright Specialist Program. And I just want to give you a little gift for coming and staying with and speaking with us today. A little memento from Fulbright Iceland.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for hosting me and for all of the Fulbright specialists and scholars. It's such an important opportunity, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.